Sarah Whitmore stood alone beside a weathered wooden fence, watching the sun disappear behind the distant Arizona mountains. The evening wind swept across the dry grasslands, carrying dust and the scent of sagebrush. Once, these sunsets had brought her peace. Now they only reminded her of how empty the world had become. 3 years earlier, Sarah had arrived in Arizona with her husband, Thomas. Like many young couples seeking a better future, they had traveled west with dreams of owning land and building a prosperous ranch. The frontier had been harsh, but they had faced every challenge together. They had endured droughts, storms, and endless labor. Through it all, Thomas had remained optimistic. Then everything changed. One autumn afternoon, a group of cattle thieves attacked a herd near the ranch. Thomas joined several neighboring ranchers in pursuit. He never returned. The men who came back carried grim expressions and avoided Sarah's eyes. They found Thomas's body near a rocky canyon miles from home. No one could tell her exactly what had happened. From that day forward, Sarah's world became silent. The ranch was small, but maintaining it alone proved nearly impossible. Every morning before sunrise, she fed livestock, repaired fences, hauled water, and worked the fields. Every evening she collapsed into bed, exhausted. The loneliness was worse than the work. The nearest settlement lay nearly 20 miles away. Weeks sometimes passed without Sarah speaking to another person. The empty chair at her table became a painful reminder of the life she had lost. As winter approached, conditions worsened. A severe drought had damaged crops across the region. Prices rose, while ranch profits fell. Sarah struggled to pay debts accumulated after Thomas's death. Each month seemed harder than the last. One cold December morning, a banker from the settlement arrived on horseback. His visit confirmed her fears. "If payments aren't made soon," he said carefully, "the property may have to be surrendered." After he left, Sarah sat on the porch for hours staring at the horizon. She had fought so hard to preserve the life she and Thomas had built. Yet, despite all her efforts, everything seemed to be slipping away. Weeks later, a powerful winter storm swept across the territory. Strong winds damaged fencing and scattered livestock. Several cattle disappeared entirely. Sarah spent days searching, but found only tracks leading into rough country. By spring, she knew she could not survive another year alone. Reluctantly, she decided to travel to a larger town where distant relatives might help her start over. Packing only essential belongings, Sarah loaded a wagon and began the journey west. The trip was difficult from the beginning. Roads were little more than rough trails winding through mountains and desert. Water was scarce. Nights were cold and lonely. Yet Sarah pressed onward. Several days into the journey, disaster struck. While crossing a rocky pass, one of the wagon wheels broke. The wagon tipped sideways, throwing supplies across the ground. Sarah spent hours attempting repairs. By sunset, she realized the damage was beyond her abilities. The nearest settlement was at least 2 days away. With limited choices, she packed what supplies she could carry and continued on foot. For 2 days she walked beneath a relentless sun. Her water dwindled rapidly. The landscape became increasingly unfamiliar. Jagged cliffs rose from the desert floor, and narrow canyons twisted between rocky ridges. On the third afternoon she finally admitted what she had feared. She was lost. Panic threatened to overwhelm her. Every direction looked the same. As darkness approached, she climbed a ridge, hoping to spot signs of civilization. Instead, she saw movement. Several riders appeared among distant rocks. At first, relief flooded through her. Then she noticed their appearance. The men wore buckskin clothing and carried weapons. Their horses moved swiftly and silently across the terrain. Sarah immediately recognized who they were. Apache warriors. Fear gripped her heart. Like many settlers, Sarah had grown up hearing frightening stories about Apache raids and attacks. Most of those stories portrayed the Apache as ruthless enemies. Without thinking, she tried to retreat. It was too late. The riders had already seen her. Within minutes they surrounded her. Sarah's hands trembled as she stood motionless. The warriors spoke among themselves in a language she could not understand. One of them dismounted and examined her supplies. Another searched the surrounding area. To Sarah's surprise, none threatened her. Finally, a tall warrior approached. He appeared older than the others, perhaps in his early 30s. His expression was calm and serious. Their eyes met. Sarah expected anger or cruelty. Instead, she saw curiosity. The warrior spoke several words in broken English. "You alone?" Sarah hesitated before nodding. The warrior studied her carefully. Then he glanced toward the darkening sky. Night was approaching rapidly. After a brief discussion with the others, he pointed toward their horses. Sarah understood immediately. They intended to take her with them. Fear returned. Yet she also realized she had little choice. Alone in the desert without water, she would likely die before reaching safety. The journey continued through the night. The Apache riders moved with remarkable confidence across terrain Sarah found impossible to navigate. Near midnight they reached a hidden valley nestled between steep cliffs. Dozens of lodges stood near a stream. Families gathered around fires. Children played while elders spoke quietly beneath the stars. Sarah stared in disbelief. The scene looked nothing like the savage image she had imagined. It resembled a community, a home. The tall warrior led her toward one of the lodges. An elderly woman greeted them. After a brief conversation in Apache, the woman offered Sarah food and water. Sarah accepted cautiously. The meal was simple, but after days of hardship, it tasted wonderful. The elderly woman smiled kindly. Sarah found herself confused. Nothing was happening as she expected. No one shouted. No one threatened her. No one treated her cruelly. The tall warrior remained nearby. Eventually he spoke again. "My name Taza." Sarah looked at him carefully. For the first time since her capture, she sensed genuine humanity behind the warrior's quiet demeanor. "I am Sarah," she replied softly. Then he pointed toward the sleeping area. "You rest." Sarah lay awake long after everyone else slept. The sounds of the camp drifted through the night air. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the ranch she had lost. She thought about the uncertain future awaiting her. Most of all, she wondered why fate had brought her here. Among strangers. Among people she had been taught to fear. As moonlight filtered through the lodge, Sarah realized her life had entered a new chapter, one she never could have imagined. And somewhere deep inside, beneath fear and uncertainty, a small spark of curiosity began to grow. What if everything she believed about these people was wrong? Sarah expected every day among the Apache to be her last as a captive. At first, she woke each morning, wondering whether someone would eventually send her away, trade her to another tribe, or abandon her somewhere far from civilization. The uncertainty weighed heavily on her mind. Yet as the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, none of those fears came true. Life in the Apache camp settled into a rhythm unlike anything she had known on the frontier. The people rose early. Women gathered water, prepared meals, and cared for children. Hunters departed before sunrise. Elders shared stories and knowledge with younger generations. Every person had responsibilities, and everyone contributed to the community. Sarah initially felt like an outsider, watching from the edge of another world. Language was the first barrier. Most members of the tribe spoke little English. Sarah knew no Apache words beyond a few simple greetings. Conversations around her often sounded like a flowing river of unfamiliar sounds. Still, people tried to help. The elderly woman who had first welcomed her took special interest in teaching her. Her name was Nita. Every day, Nita pointed to objects and repeated their Apache names. She corrected Sarah's pronunciation with patience and laughter. At first, Sarah stumbled over nearly every word. Soon she learned enough to understand simple conversations. The progress surprised her. More surprising was the fact that she enjoyed learning. For the first time since Thomas's death, her mind focused on something other than grief. Taza visited often. Unlike many of the younger warriors, he spoke English reasonably well. Whenever Sarah struggled to understand something, he quietly explained. He never forced conversation. He never demanded gratitude. His calm presence gradually became familiar. One afternoon, Sarah accompanied several women gathering wild plants near a stream. As they worked, she noticed how naturally they interacted. They joked, they teased one another. They shared stories about their children and families. The scene reminded Sarah of gatherings among settler women back east. The realization unsettled her. Growing up, she had been taught to see native tribes as completely different from her own people. Yet the more time she spent among them, the more similarities she discovered. They loved their families. They worried about their futures. They celebrated births and mourned deaths. In many ways, they were simply people trying to survive in a difficult world. One evening, Sarah sat beside a fire while children played nearby. A young girl approached carrying a handmade doll. The child offered it shyly. Sarah smiled. "Thank you." The girl grinned and sat beside her. Moments later, several other children joined them. Soon, Sarah found herself surrounded by laughter. Something warm stirred inside her. For months after Thomas's death, loneliness had been her constant companion. Now, for the first time in years, she felt connected to others. Not entirely, not completely, but enough to ease the emptiness. As spring arrived, Sarah's role within the camp gradually expanded. She helped prepare food, she repaired clothing, she taught a few children simple English words. The tribe began treating her less like a guest and more like a member of the community. Even so, Sarah never forgot she came from another world. At night she often sat beneath the stars, thinking about her old ranch. She remembered Thomas's smile. Hey, the plans they had made together. Sometimes guilt crept into her thoughts. Was she betraying his memory by finding happiness again? The question haunted her. One evening she sat alone near a stream when footsteps approached. Taza appeared carrying 2 wooden cups. He handed one to her. Neither spoke for several moments. The water reflected moonlight across the dark surface. Finally, Taza broke the silence. "You think often." Sarah laughed softly. "That obvious?" He nodded. "Think very hard." Sarah stared at the water. "I miss my husband." Taza remained silent. "I loved him," she continued. "Sometimes I feel guilty for laughing again." For a long moment, Taza said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "I understand." Sarah looked at him. His expression had changed. There was sadness in his eyes. "My wife died many winters ago." The words surprised her. "You were married?" He nodded. "And my son." Sarah's heart tightened. What happened? Taza looked toward the mountains. Sickness. The single word carried enormous weight. For a few moments, neither spoke. "I am sorry," Sarah whispered. Taza nodded slowly. After they died, camp felt empty. Every morning, every night. Sarah understood that feeling all too well. "Loneliness," she said softly. Yes, for the first time she realized the warrior she had admired from a distance carried wounds very similar to her own. That conversation changed something between them. Not immediately, not dramatically, but a quiet understanding began to grow. Weeks passed. Summer arrived. One afternoon, scouts returned with troubling news. A group of soldiers had entered nearby territory. Tension spread quickly through the camp. The Apache had experienced many conflicts with settlers and military forces over the years. Encounters rarely ended peacefully. Warriors prepared defenses. Families discussed whether they should move deeper into the mountains. Fear touched everyone, including Sarah. She knew how easily misunderstandings could become violence. Several days later, the situation worsened. A scouting party reported soldiers approaching much closer than expected. Women gathered children. Supplies were packed. The camp prepared to relocate. During the confusion, a frightened horse broke loose and charged through part of the camp. Children scattered. One small boy stumbled directly into its path. Without thinking, Sarah ran forward. The horse was moving fast. People shouted warnings. Ignoring the danger, Sarah reached the child moments before impact. She grabbed him and threw both of them aside. The horse thundered past. For a second, silence fell across the camp. Then relief erupted everywhere. The boy's mother rushed forward. Tears streamed down her face as she embraced her son. Word of Sarah's actions spread quickly. That evening, elders visited her lodge. Though she understood only part of their words, their meaning was clear. They were thanking her. Respect replaced much of the lingering suspicion some members of the tribe still felt toward her. For Sarah, the moment meant more than she expected. She was no longer merely surviving among the Apache. She belonged. Not completely, but enough to matter. As summer continued, her bond with Taza deepened. They spent hours talking while working near the camp. They discussed childhood memories, dreams, regrets, loss. Neither tried to impress the other. Neither hid painful truths. Their friendship grew naturally. One evening near the end of summer, a celebration filled the camp. Danger from soldiers had passed. Families gathered around large fires. Music echoed through the valley. Children danced beneath starlight. Sarah watched from a distance. The scene was beautiful. Taza approached quietly. "Walk with me." She nodded. Together they left the celebration and followed a trail overlooking the valley. The sounds of laughter drifted upward from below. Moonlight illuminated the mountains. For several minutes they stood silently. Finally Taza spoke. "When I first saw you in desert, you looked afraid." Sarah laughed softly. "I was terrified." "I know. And honestly, I expected the worst." Taza smiled. "Many people do." Sarah looked at him. "You changed my mind." He seemed thoughtful. "You changed your own mind, because you opened your eyes." His words lingered in the night air. Sarah realized how true they were. Everything she believed about the Apache had come from stories told by others. Living among them revealed a far more complicated reality, a more human reality. Taza turned toward her. For the first time, nervousness appeared on his face. It was a side of him she had never seen. "Sarah." She waited. He took a slow breath. "My heart has been alone many years." The seriousness in his voice made her pulse quicken. "I did not expect that to change." Sarah remained silent. "Then you came." The wind moved gently across the valley. Taza stepped closer. His eyes held warmth, honesty, and vulnerability. Not the confidence of a warrior, not the strength of a leader, simply the hope of a man. His next words were barely above a whisper. "Be my wife." Sarah's breath caught. The world seemed to stand still. Below them, distant laughter echoed from the celebration. Above them, countless stars filled the sky. Taza continued softly, "And loneliness will never touch you again." Tears filled Sarah's eyes before she realized they were there. Not because she was sad, because no one had understood her loneliness so completely. No one had seen the emptiness she carried every day. No one except him. Yet the choice before her felt enormous. Accepting would mean leaving behind the last pieces of the life she once knew. It would mean embracing a future she never imagined. A future among the Apache. A future beside Taza. Her heart whispered one answer. Her fears whispered another. Stars. Sarah realized the next decision she made would shape the rest of her life. And for the first time in years, That future no longer seemed empty. For a long time after Taza spoke those words, Sarah could not answer. The night air felt still around them. Below, the celebration continued in the valley, filled with laughter and music, yet it seemed distant now. Her entire world had narrowed to the man standing before her. "Be my wife," he had said. Such simple words, yet they carried the weight of an entire future. Sarah looked into Taza's eyes and saw no pressure there, no expectation, no demand, only hope. That made the decision even harder. Months earlier she would have refused immediately. She would have dreamed only of returning to the life she once knew. But things had changed. The Apache camp no longer felt like a place of captivity. It felt like home. The people who once seemed like strangers had become friends. The children ran to greet her each morning. The elders treated her with kindness. And Taza had become the person she trusted most. Still, accepting his proposal felt like crossing a bridge from which there would be no return. "I need time," she whispered. Taza nodded. "As much as you need." There was no disappointment in his voice, only patience. That night, Sarah slept little. Memories filled her mind. She thought about Thomas. She remembered their first meeting back east, their wedding, the long journey west, the dreams they had shared. For years after his death, she had believed her heart had died with him. Now she realized something important. Loving Taza would not erase her love for Thomas. The two truths could exist together. One belonged to her past, the other belonged to her future. As dawn approached, peace finally settled over her heart. When the first rays of sunlight touched the valley, Sarah already knew her answer. Later that morning, she found Taza repairing a saddle near the edge of camp. He looked up as she approached. Neither spoke immediately. Then Sarah smiled. A real smile, the kind she had not worn in years. "Yes." For a moment Taza simply stared, as though he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "Yes?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded. "I will marry you." A look of pure happiness crossed his face. Not excitement, not triumph, relief. The relief of a man who had spent years believing happiness would never return. Words spread through the camp quickly. Many celebrated the news. Others were surprised. A few remained uncertain. Not everyone understood the union between a white settler woman and an Apache warrior. Yet the tribal elders offered their blessing. They had watched Sarah for months. They knew her character. Most importantly, they knew Taza. The wedding took place several weeks later, beneath a clear blue sky. Family and friends gathered around them. The ceremony blended traditions from both worlds. Sarah wore a beautiful buckskin dress, embroidered by women from the tribe. Taza wore clothing that had belonged to his father. The moment was simple, yet deeply meaningful. As they exchanged promises, Sarah felt something she had not experienced since Thomas's death: belonging. For the first time in years, she was no longer alone. The first months of marriage were happy, yet challenges soon appeared. Not everyone beyond the camp accepted their union. Several nearby settlements reacted with suspicion. Settlers who learned of Sarah's marriage often viewed her as someone who had abandoned her own people. Some believed she had been manipulated. Others assumed she had been forced into marriage. Few bothered to ask the truth. Sarah discovered that prejudice existed on both sides. Likewise, some younger Apache warriors questioned whether a white woman could ever truly belong among them. Though they respected Taza, doubts remained. Living between two worlds proved more difficult than either Sarah or Taza expected. But they faced every challenge together. Whenever Sarah struggled, Taza stood beside her. Whenever Taza faced criticism, Sarah defended him. Their bond grew stronger with every obstacle. A year after their marriage, a new crisis emerged. Tensions between settlers and Apache groups increased across the region. Several violent incidents occurred near neighboring territories. Rumors spread rapidly. Fear followed. Fear often creates enemies where none exist. One autumn afternoon, scouts arrived with alarming news. A group of angry settlers planned to organize an armed expedition against nearby Apache camps. Many believed all Apache were responsible for recent attacks, regardless of which group had actually been involved. The situation threatened to spiral into bloodshed. The camp gathered to discuss what should be done. Some warriors wanted to prepare for war. Others argued for relocation. The atmosphere grew tense. Sarah listened quietly before speaking. "We cannot let fear decide for us." The gathering fell silent. She continued, "If violence begins, innocent people on both sides will suffer." An elder nodded thoughtfully. "But how do we stop it?" Sarah looked toward Taza. Together they shared the same thought. Someone needed to speak to the settlers before it was too late. The mission was dangerous. Trust between the two communities was fragile. One misunderstanding could lead to disaster. Yet Taza volunteered immediately. "I will go." Several warriors objected. "It is too dangerous. They may kill you." Taza remained calm. "If no one tries, many more will die." Sarah insisted on accompanying him. At first he refused. The risk was too great. But eventually he agreed. Together they rode toward the nearest settlement. The journey took 2 days. By the time they arrived, tensions had reached dangerous levels. Armed men patrolled the streets. Rumors of conflict dominated every conversation. When townspeople recognized Sarah, many reacted with surprise. Some had believed she was dead. Others stared at Taza with open hostility. The town meeting that followed was difficult. Voices rose, accusations flew, old wounds resurfaced. Several settlers demanded immediate retaliation against Apache groups. Sarah stood before them and spoke from the heart. She told them about the people she had lived among, the families, the children, the elders, the ordinary human lives hidden behind fear and stereotypes. Some listened, others remained skeptical. Then something unexpected happened. A commotion erupted outside. Shouts echoed through the town. People rushed into the streets. A runaway wagon had broken loose on a steep hill. Several children stood directly in its path. Panic spread instantly. Before anyone else could react, Taza moved. He sprinted toward the danger. The wagon thundered downhill at terrifying speed. People screamed warning. Taza ignored them. At the last moment, he reached the children and pushed them clear. The wagon struck him instead. The impact hurled him violently to the ground. Silence fell across the street. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sarah ran forward. Taza lay injured but alive. The children he saved were unharmed. Everything changed after that day. The settlers could no longer see him merely as an Apache warrior. They saw the man who had risked his life to save their children. Respect began replacing suspicion. Conversations replaced threats. Trust began replacing fear. It was not immediate, it was not perfect, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, leaders from both communities met regularly, were discussed instead of fought over. Trade agreements were established. Small acts of cooperation gradually strengthened relationships. Sarah and Taza became important bridges between the two worlds. Neither belonged entirely to one side anymore. Together, they belonged to both. Years passed. The valley changed. Children grew older. Families expanded. Peace, though fragile, endured. Sarah and Taza built a life richer than either had imagined. They eventually welcomed 2 children into their family, a daughter and a son. Watching Taza hold them for the first time brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The loneliness that had once haunted both of them seemed like a distant memory. One evening many years later, Sarah sat outside their home, watching the sunset. The mountains glowed gold beneath the fading light. Nearby, children laughed as they played. Grandchildren now. Time had moved faster than she ever expected. Taza joined her carrying 2 cups of tea. His hair had turned gray, so had hers. Yet when he smiled, she still saw the man who had once found her lost in the desert. For several moments they sat quietly together. Finally Taza spoke. "Do you ever think about that day?" Sarah smiled. "The day you captured me?" He laughed. "That day." She looked toward the horizon. "I think about it often. And?" Sarah reached for his hand. "And I thank God for it." Taza raised an eyebrow. "Most people do not thank God for being captured." Sarah laughed softly. "Probably not." The valley below them glowed beneath the evening sun. Families prepared meals. Children played. Friends gathered around fires. It looked very much like the camp she had first seen years ago. The camp she had feared. The camp that had eventually become home. Sarah leaned against Taza's shoulder. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she remembered the words he had whispered beneath the stars all those years ago. "Be my wife, and loneliness will never touch you again." At the time, she had not known whether such a promise was possible. Now she knew. Life had brought sorrow, loss, struggle, sacrifice. No one escaped those things. Yet loneliness no longer ruled her heart. Not because life had become easy, but because she had found someone willing to walk through every hardship beside her. As the sun disappeared beyond the mountains, Sarah smiled. The frightened widow who had once wandered lost across the desert was gone. In her place stood a woman who had discovered an unexpected truth. Sometimes the road that leads to happiness begins in the very place we fear the most. And sometimes love arrives not as a thunderstorm, but as a soft voice in the darkness, promising that we will never be alone again.